it's pretty clear right now that Canadians believe that they're worse off now than they have been, at least for the last 10 years, coincidentally, the same period that the Liberals have been in power.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. StatsCan recently updated its poverty statistics for 2022. Yes, you heard that right. It's always 2 years behind. And unfortunately, I don't think any of us will be surprised by the results.
Let's take a look.
You know, we track every week. We ask Canadians a pretty simple question. Are your personal finances, or are you better, worse, or the same compared to a year ago? And we tracked this over time, and check out the trend line. We're hitting basically new lows that we haven't seen for a really, really long time. Only 11%, that's 1 out of every 10 Canadians, believe that say that their personal finances are better off today than a year ago. That compares to 50% who report that they are worse off today than a year ago. This is a killer stat, right, for any incumbent government. Michael, remember, were you around during the Nixon-Kennedy debates?
No, not quite.
Okay, sorry. I just like to say you're looking sharp.
Thank you.
Neither was I. But in the famous Nixon-Kennedy debates, John F. Kennedy said, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And he said, if the answer is no, then it's time for a change. And it's pretty clear right now that Canadians believe that they're worse off now than they have been, at least for the last 10 years, coincidentally, the same period that the Liberals have been in power. And it speaks to why this is important. It's hard for a government, any government that's been in power, especially for a long period of time, to fight something like this. So I think unless Canadians start to feel better about their personal finances, it is going to be very difficult for the Liberals to turn this around.
Yeah, I bet it's going to be difficult. I think Nick actually asked the poignant question that all Canadians need to ask themselves. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, than you were 10 years ago? And according to his stats, 90% of them are saying no.
Well, and I think talking to the people in our lives and our Northern Perspective community, I think that's very apparent. Most Canadians are going to say, no, I am not better than I was during the Harper era.
Now, at some point, the Liberals are probably trying to put it in Canadians' head that, well, this is just a feeling, it's actually a lot better than it seems, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Fox and I have been waiting for StatsCan to update their stats, and they finally have.
You've been feeling like you're working hard but still falling behind financially. Well, Statistics Canada has a possible reason for that. Its latest household income reading shows how Canadians have less money to spend as prices and interest rates soar.
We certainly have seen some challenges in the last couple of years because of the takeoff of inflation after the COVID pandemic. And in certain areas like supermarkets, of course, everybody knows, energy prices went bananas after the lockdown. Insurance costs have gone very high. Housing costs, of course, a huge challenge. So all of that is challenging people's incomes right now.
Because the effect is still lingering, and a lot of it is because of what also happened in 2022. Take a look at this other painful chart. The stairway to higher rates, I call it, in that gray area. That was 2022 when the Bank of Canada rate went up from almost nothing to 4.25%. And that is reverberating, chewing away at budgets, chomping away at your household income. And yes, it does hurt. And we're seeing how much harder it is for those who didn't have that much to begin with.
So those are some of the initial stats. And they're validating what Canadians are actually responding to in those Nanos poll. It's not just a feeling. Things are actually worse. And, per what that economist said, housing prices are higher, insurance rates are higher, grocery rates are higher.
Well, let's take a look at why those things are higher.
So one of the key stats that you can measure a country's economy on is their poverty rate. Now, this is an interesting one, and we've been waiting for this one. So let's take a look. So this is Canada's official poverty line. And as Fox said before, the data is always 2 years behind. So we actually don't have 2023's data yet.
And we won't get that until about this time next year.
Right. So you can see that during the Stephen Harper era, the poverty rate was coming down, right? It was really high as a result of the 2008 financial crash. So his government was fighting that and was working to bring it down. There was a bit of a spike in 2015, and then when Trudeau came over and started dumping money into the economy and into Canadians by spend, yeah, the poverty rate started to come down. And oh, look what happened in COVID. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that was 2020. It dropped to 6.4%. Now, Fox and I have talked about this repeatedly. Why do you think that would have dropped so sharply in 6.4%, Fox?
It's because everybody was receiving CERB payments.
Right. So what that would have done is, in terms of their tax returns, everyone would have reported that they received CERB, so their income would have skyrocketed. That is all captured by Stats Canada, and Stats Canada measures, you know, the poverty rate based on the median family income. So everyone's income would have been a lot higher than it normally was because of CERB. So that's why the poverty rate came down. But oh look, in 2021 it climbed back up, and in 2022 it shot back up at almost the same rate as it shot down from 2019. So in 2022, it's almost matched pre-COVID levels, and we don't even know what it's at for 2023. If it's continued on that trend line, it's actually going to be close to hitting the poverty rate that the Liberals actually started with. Now, this is in stark contrast to what Chrystia Freeland has been telling us, bragging about. Take a look.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can see through these conservatives, and they know that the only thing these conservatives know how to do is cut, and the people who suffer the most are the most vulnerable. If they want to push Canadians into poverty, we won't let them. Since we have formed government, 2.3 million Canadians are out of poverty. Poverty in Canada was at 14.5% when the Conservatives left office. Today, it's down to 7.4%. Since we formed government, 2.3 million Canadians have been lifted out of poverty. The poverty rate in Canada has been cut in half.
Now, if you recall in that CBC video, they also talked about interest rates being a major factor here. They were at, something like 0.25%, and they shot up to 5%. Well, who could have predicted that? That would never have happened. Remember Trudeau's infamous quote,
"Interest rates are at historic lows, Glenn."
So of course everyone purchased housing and took out loans, and it almost resembles the 1920s where everyone discovered credit. Credit was invented almost in the 1920s, so everyone started taking out all of this money, spending it all. The economy was great because there was all this new money in the economy. And then what happened? There was the crash of 29. So everyone paid the price for that. Now, when it comes to the stats and poverty, we have to take a deeper dive and understand what are the major causes of that. So this is on the Canada StatCan website. So this is from the government. So as you can see, in 2015, the official poverty rate was at 14.5%. And they love showing that this actually has decreased over time. Okay, fine. And it plummeted down to 6.4% because of CERB, as we saw in that other chart. But now it's jumped back up to 9.9%. Interesting how the line isn't as sharp on this graph. I find that very interesting. But anyway, what contributes to poverty?
So the top indicator is deep income poverty, which is defined as persons whose family disposable income is below 75% of Canada's official poverty line. If we look at the percentage change, it's up almost 40% from the previous year, from 2021.
That's a really, really disturbing number, everybody. So deep income poverty has increased almost 40%. Not 40% of Canadians, but 40% of the value. That's a lot.
Another key indicator, food insecurity, which is defined as persons living in households that reported moderate or severe food insecurity. It's up 31%.
So food insecurity is basically, do you know when you're going to get your next meal?
It's gone from 12.9% in 2021 to 16.9% in 2022, and I bet it's even higher for 23 and 24. We've heard the Conservatives cite the stat quite often. 1.8 million Canadians have used a food bank in the past month. That's almost 5% of our population. This is an interesting stat that relates to poverty, is the literacy and numeracy. So how well can individuals read, or how well can they perform basic arithmetic? So low literacy in 15-year-olds is up 31.2%, and low numeracy in 15-year-olds is up 32.5%. We don't have stats as to why that is, but I have a sneaking suspicion it has to do with technology, and that teenagers are spending more time on their phones, on their tablets, than they are studying or learning new skills that they may have learned 20 years ago.
The other possibility, which is a heartbreaking one, is it could also be related to the drastic increase in homelessness in the country. So if these 15-year-olds are living with their parents in tents, there's a good possibility they are not going to school, and they're just helping, their mom or their dad, or maybe they're by themselves. They're just trying to find their next meal, which relates to the food insecurity spike.
Well, and that's another good point, Cypher. They may not even necessarily be homeless, but 15-year-olds can usually go out into the world and get a job. So maybe they are doing that out of necessity instead of, interest, the way that we did when we were younger.
And going to school.
That's right. They're going and seeking jobs instead of attending classes and going to school because they need to help support their families.
So if you look, wages have increased slightly overall. But what does that really tell us? It actually doesn't tell us a lot. What it does tell us, though, is that the cost of everything has gone up, but wages have not kept up with it, which is no surprise to anybody, right? No surprise at all. Now, one thing I want to go back to this graph. So we were taking a look at this, and the one thing that we took into consideration is when these numbers were actually published. So you have 6.4% for 2020, 7.4% as we saw for 2021, and 9.9% for 2022. That's the official poverty rate. Well, it got us thinking. How many people were in Canada in 2020? There was around 38 million people. So what is 6.4% of 38 million people? That works out to about 2.4 million people in poverty. Okay. Now, Christian Freeland, as you keep hearing her say, oh, well, we've lifted 2.4 million people out of poverty. Yeah, you've technically lifted 2.4 million people out of poverty since 2015. Now, the interesting thing is she is using the 2021 stat of 7.4%. She doesn't tell you that it was actually lower in COVID. Doesn't want to tell you that. Now, if we look at the 9.9% poverty rate in 2022, that's actually a lot worse than it sounds, because there wasn't 38 million people in Canada in 2022. There was almost 39 million. So it went up 1 million within 2 years. And that aligns perfectly with Trudeau's 500,000 new immigrants a year. So what does that 9.9% mean now? Well, that 9.9% means that the number of people that were in poverty in 2022 jumped from 2.4 million to 3.9 million people, which means they actually put 1.5 million people back into poverty. That's the stat that Chrystia Freeland should be saying. And here's this disturbing thing. Tent cities and all of the homelessness and all of that, we weren't seeing that with any significant prevalence in 2022. We really started to see it in 2023, and we see it everywhere in 2024. So the real question is going to be, what is the poverty rate now? Well, we're going to have to wait until next year to get those numbers. But the good news is that we've endured 10 years of this disastrous Liberal government. We have less than 2 months to actually find out if Trudeau is going to last the summer. By all indications, they're not, because the polling numbers haven't moved an inch since this budget was dropped. And they also haven't moved since, Pierre was ejected from Parliament, and that he wasn't acting with any prime ministerial decor and any of that. So the Conservatives are still 20 points up, and we are less than a year and a half away from the latest possible federal election. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel finally, folks. And we're getting closer to it with each passing day.